Thanks, Jenny, for that. Jenny, for that introduction. Yeah, kia ora, morena. As Jenny said, it's six o'clock in the morning here in New Zealand, so I don't see too many people in the chat box who've got up at that time of morning. They've all wished us luck and said they'll watch the recording. Yeah, so thank you very much. I did see one in the chat box from Cardigan in Wales, which is my original hometown. So I think that might be my old friend Andrew Toft, who's a physiotherapist as well, who'll be interested in this. Bit of a slow transition here, but just to set the scene, I've been working in the youth sport area for about 15 years in New Zealand in a research environment. And what's happening here, Jodie, that we're in a sort of permanent loop with the slides.
Yeah, I've got a little message up here saying I can't get rid of the. Can you see the meeting has been recorded message, or is that not on your screen?
No, that's gone. Yeah.
Okay, fine. It's on mine. I can't get rid of it. If I click it, it must be under your control at the moment.
Okay, I'm trying to move.
It's all good. You continue.
Bit of a time lag. So I've been working in the youth sport area for about 15 years doing research here in New Zealand, and there's been a shared concern about what we would call the intensification of the youth sport experience, junior and youth sport experience here in New Zealand. And that concern is shared between our government agency, Sport New Zealand, some of our national sporting organisations, and particularly clinicians and people on the ground who are saying that they were increasingly seeing an increase in sports injuries in the younger athlete. And some of these were overuse injuries, which previously they'd only seen with the professional athletes. So I've done a lot of work with Chris Watman, and he's got a physiotherapist background, and we were working together. And then I came across Jodie. I was actually getting treated for one of my very many injuries in her physiotherapy clinic. I started chatting with her and her colleagues about some of these issues, and then that evolved into be really cool to do some research together, look at what was actually happening on the ground, to actually look at the research to see what they were actually seeing in the clinics. There was evidence to support that. So we started having a conversation, and then Jodie came into us at AUT, and Jodie was looking at then possibly doing a master's study. So Jodie, I'll just hand over to you briefly before we actually get into the details of your study, but maybe talk a little bit about that relationship and how it evolved.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Simon. So as Simon said, he was actually one of our patients in our clinic, and I've been working in musculoskeletal physiotherapy for over 20 years. And over that time, I've been seeing this real change in our clientele, with clients getting younger, injuries getting, I guess, more serious. But yeah, definitely a bit of a trend of these younger kids coming through the door with certainly a lot of these overuse injuries and definitely a lot of other acute injuries as well. And it kind of just got us thinking that something was changing and we weren't quite sure what. And meeting Simon was kind of just one of those chance meetings, I guess. But we'd already been discussing as a group of clinicians what we needed to look into, what could we do, what we were able to say to the parents and to the students alike about what's going on and how could we change these risks. So it kind of sent me down that journey of looking into some of the academic research behind specialisation, behind sports volume. And yeah, with that, we ended up being, I guess, a team working onto this topic. So it was a bit of chance, but also definitely something that was heading in that direction anyway.
Yeah, cool. And then we sort of got the invitation from Jenny and Amy. I particularly like the title of the book, The Myths of Sport Coaching, and it seemed to resonate with what we were seeing here, because we felt that this notion of 10,000 hours of practice is sort of like an almost given, it's an accepted, easy to hang on to a sort of phrase that resonates, but it also drives a lot of structures and some of the behaviours that we were concerned about. I'm trying to move the slides on here. We're not on a real time lag. So just looking recently as we were preparing for this, I remember it was actually a professor of psychology wrote an article a couple of years ago in one of our magazines, and he was talking about the need for us to practice to become good at something, and the context wasn't sport. I tried to track that article down, but that was somebody who was actually an academic who was doing research, had already brought into this notion. It's a given, you know, it's been established. It can't be questioned. And then I found this from earlier this year. There's one of our politicians, Richard Prebble, and he was talking about learning and being critical of the education system in New Zealand. But he was also making, as politicians do, they jump from thing to thing. He was also talking about the crashes that we're getting so many young drivers experience it. But studies of people who are very successful reveal that mastering any worthwhile skill requires 6,000 hours of practice. To be world-class requires 10,000 hours of practice. So it's there, it's very visible. People understand it. People from a non-sporting background feel that to be elite, you know, you need to practice, dedicated, deliberate practice for 10,000 hours. And in the sports context, we seem to have bought into that notion. Now, I'm not here to go into the research that's been done about 10,000 hours and that deliberate practice. I know Ed Collin has done that in much more detail. That's much more his area. But we were more concerned from the social discourse that was dominating this notion of 10,000 hours, that was creating structures that were pushing young people into earlier areas of sport and possibly specializing, spending too much time in one sport, taking away the fun and the diversification that sport can offer if you play other sports, and looking at the impact of that. So, you know, in relation to the myth of 10,000 hours, we were interested in unpacking that specifically in relation to early specialization, and then to narrow it down again to look at the relationship between early specialization, training volume and load, and injuries. So hence the study that Jodie embarked upon came about. This is from a media coverage in New Zealand, but we've got injuries in New Zealand are handled by the ACC. So that's the Accident Compensation Corporation. So if you get an injury in any walk of life, but including sport, and you seek treatment for it, you will have an ACC claim going. What that means for us as researchers is great. There's a huge data bank of information there related to injuries, what injuries occurred. But the statistics from ACC in the decade leading up to about 2020 showed that there was a 60% increase in sports-related injuries in the 10 to 14 age group over the past decade. And that was double the increase that was being witnessed in any other age range. So you can see here the journalism, you know, an alarming spike in injuries, a surge in sports-related injuries, but the data does show that. Now, there are other factors at play. You know, is that strictly the case? But the data is certainly telling a story that we are seeing an increase, which Jodie's gut feeling and her colleagues in the clinics, we are seeing an increase in sports injuries. So, Jodie, I'm going to hand over to you now, and we're going to talk a little bit about Jodie's study in particular, and then we'll come back to me later and I'll talk about what it means in the New Zealand context and some of the changes that are taking place here as a result of not only Jodie's study, but other research as well.
Cool, thanks, Simon. So as Simon talked to, the sort of myths or misconceptions we're going to kind of talk through in the next few slides is about that 10,000 hours, that you need that to be an elite sports person. I want to kind of unpack how the whole concept of specializing might increase the chance of success or becoming an elite athlete, because I think that's something that often drives these young athletes to push through pain, push through injuries. Certainly I hear that a lot in my clinic. And obviously that last one, you know, that's my whole study was looking at, does early specialization increase injury in this young population? And I want to kind of unpack that statement a little bit, because I think we found some findings that might suggest there's multiple things at play rather than just the pure fact that someone is early specialized. So we'll unpack that statement a little bit as we go through as well. So with that in mind, you know, early specialization, why are we even worried about it? You know, why does it create an injury risk? And I guess in the young population, I'm talking about some of the things that happens in their journey to get an injury. When a young person is growing, they typically have some sort of vulnerabilities in their musculoskeletal system. One of those is as their long bones grow, they tend to have this attachment of the tendons that tends to tug a little way, and that can create some pain or some sort of overuse type injuries. And what we see is that sort of the research tells us that typically young people are growing somewhere between that 12 and 14-year age group. You can see that statement on the slide that the typical peak height velocity for girls is anywhere between 12.1 years and boys 13.7 years. Those two pictures I put on this slide actually came from the competition that I did all my research at. This is a big intermediate or middle schools competition that's run every year here in New Zealand. And I guess it's become one of those kind of pivotal competitions that a lot of young athletes first strive to get to. However, in saying that, it also encourages a lot of people from rural schools. Some schools just literally have enough kids to put one team or one sport. So you get a real mix of abilities and levels at this competition. But what those pictures show is exactly what we're seeing in this age group, is the vulnerability for young people when they're playing sport comes through the fact that so many are grown at different rates. The picture with the two young chaps in the blue, just shows the difference in height. You've got the physical difference of those basketballers of someone who's clearly gone through puberty a lot quicker than others. And so those risk factors are there in the sport. What we were seeing in the clinic, and I think Simon's already alluded to the statistics, so we were watching these kids come through the door and noticing that they were coming through much more frequently. And some of the injuries they were coming through with were very typical of these growth or age-related injuries. In ACC statistics that Simon mentioned before, they don't always capture those gradual onset injuries because the system is designed to literally register any injuries that happen acutely or suddenly. However, in the clinic, we often talk to these young athletes who have come in with an acute ankle sprain, for example, who then start telling us about, well, actually, for the last 6 to 12 months, I've been having this pain in my ankles. Every time I play sport, it hurts. I'm limping. So there's a lot of sort of underlying stuff going on with some of these growth-related injuries that probably assist in those statistics of the acute injuries. Injuries are definitely on the increase. And when you look at the literature base out there, there is an association between specialisation and injury, and that's confirmed. However, a lot of those studies that have been done are not necessarily looking into that sort of early developmental stage. So the difference between early specialisation and sports specialisation is something I kind of want to refer to a few times in the next few slides. Certainly in my research, I was concerned about that young age group when there is that sort of physiological vulnerability as they're going through their peak growth periods. There was a meta-analysis, I guess, that looked at most of the specialisation studies, and they definitely showed that there was an increase in injury rate as the athlete became more specialised. And actually our colleague and co-author of the book, Chris, is involved in a study that's about to be published as well here in New Zealand. And they looked at responses from over 15,000 participants, and they could see that they noticed that the injury was increasing as the degree of specialisation increased. And that was consistent against all the age groups. Interestingly enough, there were some differences amongst the different sports, and I think that's something that's worthy of mentioning as we go through in the next slides as well. So the question after this is it early specialisation that's causing this injury spike, or is there more to it? So the research in the area and how I got into doing my master's study was reading some of these studies, most of them coming out of the United States. One of the, I guess, pivotal studies was one by Janthi in 2015, and he looked at a whole lot of athletes that had come through the sports medicine clinic and looked at the associations between the degree of specialisation, and the injuries that they were seeing. He also is the one that sort of defined, I guess, the sports specialisation statement, and he used to use a statement that said specialisation was intensive participation in one sport year-round at the exclusion of other sports. And with that, he developed a 3-point scale to measure specialisation. And that 3-point scale asked the athletes 3 questions. That was, did they have a main sport? Had they quit all other sports because of that main sport? And did they play that main sport for more than 8 months of the year? And that 3-point scale was used in a lot of this research to define what was what state of specialisation the athletes were in. And so the athlete could be confirmed as being a high specialiser, that is, they answered yes to all 3 of those questions, or they could be moderate or medium, they'd answered yes to 2 of the 3 questions, or they were considered low specialised, which is they answered yes to only 1 of those questions or to none. And over the sort of 5 years, I guess, leading up to when I was doing my master's in 2017, there had been about 6 or 7 studies that confirmed that there was an association with high sports specialisation and overuse injuries. There were some mixed findings when it came to specialisation and acute injuries, and it was really mixed. Some of the studies showed no specialisation at all, no association at all, and then some showed a small association, others slightly larger. And I think that comes down to a lot of the way the studies were done, some of the methodology, some of the ways they described injury or defined injury. There was one prospective study, that second statement on the slide, and that sort of stated that highly specialised athletes that they followed through a season had a much higher chance that they had an injury that was either considered gradual or recurrent than the athletes that were in the low specialisation group. And then there are some other studies that kind of supported what our colleague Chris is about to publish as well, that there was some variation between the sports. So the Polska study in 2017 looked at highly specialised athletes. All of them were highly specialised, but they wanted to see if they had a difference between the injury rates in individual and team sports. And they did see that the specialised athletes participating in individual sports were much more likely to report an overuse injury, but much less likely to report an acute injury when they compared that to their team sport athletes. The key thing with a lot of this research in the specialisation space, and certainly before I did my master's, was that the cohort or the age range was quite wide. So it covered from anywhere from about 7 years right up to about 18 years. So again, it doesn't really necessarily answer the question that early specialisation is causing this injury rate. Certainly there's an association here between specialising in a sport. But, I was very interested to see if that early specialisation was the key. The second thing that we sort of talk about when we're in the clinic space is, okay, early specialisation is one risk factor, but, what about the simple volume? And I think in my study, we were talking to these kids down at this big competition, and the way we asked them these questions is we asked them the specialisation questions, and then we asked them to fill out a diary of what their typical week looked like in the sports scene. So in the summer months and in the winter months, they would write out from a Saturday through to the following Monday sort of diary of what they were doing, trainings, competitions. And that was how we worked out what their seasons looked like and what their weekly structures looked like. And it was interesting when we looked at the research before we did the study, there was quite a mixture of support for and against the association of doing too much sport and getting injured. There were about 19 studies that sort of came up in the literature search, and about 11 of them showed a positive association between increasing the amount of volume you do weekly and sustaining an injury. Volume was not always associated with overuse injury, which was interesting because my logical brain said the more you do, the more likely you're going to get overused, but that wasn't always the case. In fact, only 5 studies out of 11 showed that association. But I wanted to sort of allude to some of the caution there, because the definitions used for both what an injury was defined and how volume was defined was so varied that it's really hard to compare a lot of this research and come up with a clear statement on what's going on. For example, injury was often defined as only losing time from matches for 2 weeks. Other times it was any kind of indication of pain. So those are very different levels of injury. And then volume was described as anything from how much time you spent weekly, how many matches you played per season, how many months you played per year, how many days you played per week. And then some specific studies, for example, the baseball studies, it was how many pitches you threw in a training session. So many different ways of measuring volume. What was consistent across all the volume research, however, was that there was this increased injury risk if youth athletes participated in more organised sport hours per week than their chronological age. And also that if they participated in the same sport for more than 8 months of the year, they had an increased risk of injury. So that kind of confirms what they, I guess, what theoretically we think the proposed mechanism is for this overuse injury, and that is that you sort of apply this inappropriate training load and have a bit of a lack of diversified movement skills when you're going through that young phase of development, and that can lead to this overuse injury. And I guess I haven't really alluded much to the lack of diverse movement skills, but that sort of comes through a lot of the research that looks at the different sort of transfer of skills between different sports. And again, what we know is in that early development stage, so in that sort of prepubertal stage and going through into that early young adolescent stage, there's a lot of learning both in a social and emotional, physical as well, development stuff, and that sort of needs to happen in an environment where they've been exposed to a lot of different change. And so in my study, we talked to 914 different children over the course of a week down at the competition, and we did this in person. So there was a big group of us sort of walking around, actually talking to the athletes. And as I said before, they would fill out this questionnaire that sort of marked yes or no's to those specialisation questions. They filled out their training diary, and then the last part was have you had an injury? And if any student marked that they had an injury in the last 12 months, we would interview them one-on-one, and we would talk to them about this injury. What happened? What were you doing? Did it stop you from playing sport? Did you play through? So there was a lot more information that we got from our injured athletes. And I'm just going to jump forward a couple of slides before I go into the results, because I guess what was alarming is that we had 74% of our participants that we talked to actually reported an injury of some sort in the 12 months before, and 22% of them were overuse injuries. So that's kind of in keeping with what I was seeing in the clinic. There's a lot of these injuries coming through, but probably this 22% of overuse injuries that aren't even being recorded in our statistics exist. And yeah, of interest, again, 62% occurred in the lower limb, and other authors have found that as well. So going back to our study, once we analysed all the data, we wanted to have a look at the associations between both specialisation and volume-based recommendations. And as you can see from this slide here, we actually didn't find any association between an athlete who was highly specialised in our cohort and sustaining a gradual onset injury. However, we did see that the athletes in that highly specialised, the athletes in our group who were exceeding the average weekly hours based on their age were 2.5 times more likely to sustain an overuse injury than the athletes that weren't exceeding that weekly volume. We also saw that our athletes who were playing sport for more than 8 months of the year without a break, and in a lot of the cases it was closer to 12 months. So basically they're crossing seasons there. We saw that those athletes were more than 1.5 times more likely to get injured than the ones that weren't playing sport that crossed those seasons. And those two findings were independent of what level of specialisation they were. So even if this athlete was only a moderately specialised or even low specialised, and that they were playing lots of sports perhaps, but they were doing a lot of hours, and one sport that did cross that 8-month, they were still at risk of injury. So I guess that's that unpacking of, is it just being specialised that's making these injuries happen? And my answer in this age group is that often it's not just specialisation. And I think, again, going back to what we found in my study, if we looked at the kids that marked themselves or came out of the score as being moderately specialised, when we looked through a lot of their diaries, a lot of these kids were moderately specialised because they were still sampling sports. They were playing, maybe 3 or 4 different sports, but they had at least one sport in there for a lot of the time that was their main sport and their specialised sport, and they were playing it for more than 8 months of the year. So in essence, they were a specialised athlete with a whole lot of other sports that are chucked in to try and, I guess, meet that recommendation that sampling is better for them. However, these young athletes, when we looked at the data, actually our moderately specialised group had a higher risk of injury than our highly specialised group. So it kind of brings in how that relates to what I might be doing in my clinic with my athletes, because essentially people come and sit in front of me and tell me about their injuries and pains, and often I'm asking them to tell me about what they're doing in their training week. And when we sit down to sort of unpack what they're doing, a lot of the time we are finding this pattern of, these kids doing a lot of sport with very little rest days. Most of them don't do much else outside of their sport because they're too tired or they just simply don't have time. A lot of them are feeling, I guess, the pressure to continue the sport that they love the most in the off season, because there are available sessions to improve their skills as it's sold to them. And so the talks that I tend to have with my athletes is based on some kind of really simple recommendations that we took from the study that I did, and certainly some of the overseas information as well. And the key things that I say to them is, look, keeping it seasonal seems to reduce your risk of injury. So if you play a sport that you love, have a break from it. Ideally, play the sport in the season and then play a different sport over the off season. That transferable skills are really valuable. You can still train hard, you can still develop strength, you can still develop skill, you won't lose out on your pathway. And again, that conversation about specialisation not necessarily being necessary to lead to success is a conversation we often have. Then the other main topic that we talk about is just don't do too much. And those guidelines of, okay, if you're 12 years old, you shouldn't be doing more than 12 hours of organised sport is really simplistic, but it's very easy for a parent and a young athlete to grasp. And often when we sit down and look at their hours, they might not be exceeding that, but they might have spread out their sport over every day of the week. So I also talk about don't do too much and make sure you have a couple of days rest. And part of that reason for having a couple of days rest is we know if you've got a chance to go out and just play with your friends, just be a normal young teenager, then you actually lower your risk of injury as well. So that's that concept of free play. And it's something that we did look in our study, as other authors have as well, in that if the kids were doing, a ratio of more than twice as much organised sports to what they got to do outside of organised sports, so we're talking about non-structured free play, skateboarding, surfing, riding your bike, but that kind of stuff that a lot of these athletes weren't having time to do. As soon as that ratio sort of increased beyond that 2 to 1, their risk of injury went up as well. So the third recommendation that we make to our young athletes is make sure you have some off days so you can go and do some play, basically. And I'll hand back to Simon now. So that's kind of the context of how we use that information in the clinic. And I think now it's definitely started to change, I guess, the mindset, and we can sit down and we can help young athletes work through what is an appropriate amount of load, especially with their injury that they've come to see me about, but also moving forwards. And I think that comes through the clinical space, but the support is also needed outside of the clinical space. And this is what Simon's going to allude to now, that our sporting bodies, I guess, are starting to step in and do.
Sure. Thanks, Jodie. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about what's happening in the broader space. The injury story is one part of the puzzle. And back in 2015, our government agency for sport, Sport New Zealand, were doing some work and came up with a talent plan, identified problems in the youth sports system, the junior and youth sports system. That evolved into 2018, and the photo here is of 5 CEOs from 5 of our top sports from participation point of view, and that's football, hockey, cricket, netball, and rugby. And the 5 CEOs of the National Sports Organisation signed up with a commitment to change the face of youth sport. And what Sport New Zealand called for as well was for all people who are part of the system to come together, to work together, to have an impact on the system. And that includes researchers as well. So you're talking about coaches, coach educators, teachers in schools. So with the 5 leading CEOs coming to the table, it was a commitment, at least, to move forward. So what that evolved into shortly afterwards was a campaign which became known as Balance is Better. They were looking for a very simple message which could possibly challenge what they were seeing as this push towards early specialization, with young people focusing on one sport. So the Balance is Better is like an overarching philosophical approach that's been rolled out across New Zealand to underpin and support changes that sports organizations are making on the ground. There's a huge resource being set up online. The example you've got here, there's information for parents, information for coaches, but also we know that system structures, like it's the competition structures and the processes that are in place, the selection, the deselection, which shape much of the coach behavior that we're concerned about. I work a lot in coach education, and I'm so a little bit tired of seeing research that says at the end of this study, we recommend that coaches need to do this. Coaches need to do that. Well, coaches for the large part in the junior and youth sport are volunteers, sort of giving on their time. So the onus really needs to be on the organizations, that organizations need to educate coaches to be more aware of certain things. That's why I really like the recommendations that have come from Jodie's study and from which draw upon previous research has been done. It's really simple, right? They're easy to remember messages. You shouldn't be doing one sport for more than 8 months of the year. Okay, you need to balance the amount of sport you're doing with free play. And we're doing a lot of research into the benefits of free and risky play. And as we know, in many societies, that's declining. It's a real concern. And for many young people, the only exposure they get to physical activity is in a very organized, structured environment, which is often the sports space. And then the more hours per week than your age. If you're 12 years of age, you shouldn't be doing more than 12 hours per week in an organized sports activity. So it's really, really, really simple messages that clinicians can give to parents who've come to them, but actually to front foot it that coaches need to be aware of and parents need to be aware of. So this is the campaign that happened in New Zealand in 2018. Then, as we all know, the world went into lockdown. And the next part of the campaign was for sports to actually go and do things, to make changes. So there was a little bit of a hiatus. It went on hold. And it sort of just when we came out of the pandemic, started to gain momentum again. And our sports are starting to make changes. So one of the key messages to come through is redefining success. So possibly we don't define success by the gold medal that you get as an 11-year-old or 12-year-old in a representative tournament, or even having national selection in some sports. Maybe we need to define success in children's sport by the number of participants that return each year. We need to focus on what we call an environment of development as opposed to an environment of performance in children's sport. And the message from Balance is Better, if we can just delay that specialization. So maybe a better word is investing. So for young people to invest when they are ready to invest, as opposed to the structures forcing them parents to choose and select a sport that their children will specialize in. We know from some of the research that we've done that young people are forced into one sport. Quite often they go into the secondary school space. And if a talented athlete is identified, each of the sports wants them. And then when they get them, they don't want them playing other sports due to risk of injury. So we know that the structures and systems and processes put in place are pushing young people to specialize. So I'm like again here. A lot of the work we do here in New Zealand, one of the things that Sport New Zealand are asking us, and the national sports organisations are saying to us, we really need evidence. We're making changes here, and we're getting backlash from parents. It's PC, it's soft. Okay, it's not the way that things are traditionally done. You're holding back my child who's going to be an elite performer. So there's a huge desire for evidence. So we spent the last 10 to 15 years doing New Zealand specific studies. The studies we do are based on the shoulders of those who've gone before us and working in other countries. We rely a lot on the work of Jean Coté and his developmental model of sports participation, which underpins some of the Balance is Better messaging, where we advocate for, up until the ages of 11, that we go through what we call a sampling phase. So we really want children in New Zealand to experiment, to diversify, to play a lot of different sports, characterized by a lot of deliberate play with low amounts of deliberate practice. And I know Ed Collin went into that in some detail in the previous presentation, and to participate in several sports. And we know that if you look at the far right of the screen, that early specialization is understood to be a pathway to elite performance. And there's research that indicates that a lot of athletes have gone through that pathway. But what we also know, there are a huge amount of costs associated with that. So Jodie's talked about the injury risk and the injury cost, but a lot of the research we're doing in New Zealand as well, we're finding that there's burnout, there's dropout from sport due to perceived over-competitive coaching and the structures that put pressure on young people. So the message is, okay, if young people want to invest, they invest, but do it later when they still play a couple of sports, just keep that diversification going for as long as possible. For those who don't want to invest, don't create a system that forces, is like a pyramid. We've got a lot of people at the bottom, which narrows down, and we only have a few people coming out at the top, which is what we've got at the moment. So we still want people to participate through the teenage years, but we would need to keep the door open for them, and that the pathways are there for them just to carry on playing. And we know that the potential outcomes of that they're more likely to carry on being physically active, participating in organized sport, social sport as they move into adult years, more likely to be involved in clubs and give back as volunteers, more likely to bring their children back and get them involved in sport. But we also feel in the middle way that it is a pathway to elite performance as well. And it's a better way. So some of the research we've been doing in New Zealand, I've started to look at that, actually support that message. So one of my postgraduate students, again, based on the timeline work of Jean Coté from many years ago, interviewed 8 elite New Zealand hockey players, male and female, and looked at their trajectory through sport from childhood through to the elite level. So this is one current black stick international hockey player. And you can see, if you look at his timeline, the number of sports that he played from the age of 5. He was in primary school playing rugby, soccer, mountain biking, swimming and basketball. As he moved through to ages 8 and 9, he was still playing a huge range of sports, summer sports, winter sports. And he was also starting, obviously, a very talented one. He's from a rural area of New Zealand. So if you happen to be good at one sport and you're in a small catchment area, you're likely to be sort of selectable for a range of sports. So you can see here that this person was playing a lot of sports and didn't specialize in hockey, solely in hockey, until, well, almost the age of 17 and 18. And at the ages of 17 and 18, he was playing elite level under 21 for New Zealand, and also transitioning into the senior side. The interesting part, or one of the interesting parts of the study that Bobby did, was what these 8 athletes had in common was that they engaged in a huge amount of what we call free and risky play. So the organized sport experience for them wasn't the only physical activity experience they were getting. They were diversifying, playing multiple sports, transferable skills, but they were also engaging in a lot of free and risky play. They were from rural New Zealand. Many of them grew up on farms. And Bobby Newport, we've published that story about that. That built on a previous study done in 2012 by Ken Hodge, who looked at 20 elite New Zealand athletes. And these were mainly in the Olympic sport. And they also had a very similar childhood story on how they became elite. So we're starting to find evidence that you don't have to specialize early to be an elite performer, that there are different ways of doing it, what we feel are better ways. So the evidence we're starting to get in New Zealand is really important, because I know we've got an international audience here. You know, we're a small country. A lot of the research that we rely on has been done in the United States, in Europe. It doesn't resonate with New Zealand parents. Oh yeah, that was the United States, that was NFL, or that was football in Europe, okay? New Zealand, we're different. So it was really, really important for us to start finding these New Zealand stories which actually supported the work, not surprisingly, of what had been done overseas. So we've, as part of the balance.
Sorry for interrupting you, Simon. Just going to give you, it's just going on 10:10. We have 8 questions in the chat box. So if you just be mindful of that. I know there's some really eager people with brilliant questions. I didn't want to interrupt your flow there, but I'm trying to find a balance. So just giving you a heads up on the time. Thanks.
Okay, I'll just wrap up here then. So one of the other things is we've got a massive parent education program being delivered. It was piloted in Auckland and it's been rolled out nationwide, called Good Sports. And it basically is across the country, working with sports clubs, administrators, national sports organizations, regional sports organizations, and talking about the difference between a climate of performance, which can be characterized by early selection, early representative tournaments, and we're advocating for a climate of development. So that's been hugely successful, delivered to thousands of people across New Zealand. So there's multiple messaging happening through the Balance is Better messaging, but also on the ground, face-to-face workshops that we're doing. Some of the changes that sports have made is they've started delaying representative tournaments. So rugby, huge sport of cultural and historical significance in New Zealand, were one of the first sports. Netball had done it before them. They basically scrapped a national representative tournament and they replaced it with skill development camps. Huge social and media backlash, but they were coming to us and they go, tell us we're right. Tell us we're right in what we're doing. Tell us that the evidence supports us. So we've been able to provide evidence to allow sports organizations to make brave changes to the structures that they deliver, to remove representative tournaments, and, you know, obviously then to deal with the backlash from parents and coaches and sometimes from the clubs themselves to go, this is backed by evidence. The other things we're seeing are attitudes to injuries. A lot of concussion studies where players play down concussion at an early age and carry on playing. We've got a maturation bias we've identified in cricket. We've published a study on that where we've got what we call late maturers coming through the system due to the selection processes that are in place too early. In New Zealand, we've got a dropout. First major dropout happens at ages 15. Then again, the second one is post-secondary school. And then we've also got a number of qualitative studies looked at controlling coach behaviors, adult behavior, which is basically leading to contributing to the dropout story that we're seeing. I just wanted to finish with some of the things that we're doing in New Zealand. The trend is we're actually trying to change the narrative, to change the culture of junior and youth sport moving forward, and trying to find evidence that helps the people on the ground make the brave decisions that they're making. So I think that's it, Jen. We've got a load of references at the end based on the studies that we did, but yeah, happy to go to questions now.
Thank you so much. I know that we've got a mix of people in the room that might be able to influence change in their environment, might just be able to take the incredible amount of information, research, and try and contextualize, understand it for their environment. Like you said, from a New Zealand perspective, not looking at, global and, NFL or NBA stuff and kind of seeing what it means in their environment. So yeah, enough for me. Great stuff. So much notes myself, and I've such a keen interest in this. Jeff has asked the question: could some of these injuries be due to bad technique from ill-informed coaches?
From my layperson's objective, I'll say that I know that when we're working with netball, they're seeing an increase in ACL injuries with young people, but Jodie's best qualified to speak to that from a clinician perspective.
Yeah, and I think movement competency is an issue we see definitely in that young adolescent age, and I don't know if that's necessarily a failure of the coach per se. You know, as a young athlete grows, it's a really common phase. We affectionately call it the baby giraffe phase in the clinic, where we see these athletes with these really long limbs and muscles that don't really know how to control them. And so a lot of that kind of, you know, altered movement patterns, the valgus knee, etc., is clearly contributing to these injuries. But perhaps it's the intensity of the sport environment that increases the risk whilst they're going through those phases of very normal, uncoordinated movement.
Jodie, the free play helps that though, right? The diverse movements that you engage in, the more diverse activities you engage in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, that makes a lot of logical sense to me. You know, if a kid's out there scooting, skating, jumping up, and you see it on the sports fields and in the clinic as well, those are the kids that just seem to have worked out how to move better, and they do that sort of in a very natural way rather than being coached how to move better. And I think the more free play we can encourage during those developmental years, the better.
Appreciate that, thank you. Apologies if I don't pronounce your name. Mimi Laney has said, I was looking at journals that would help in my research, and I came across a journal that said that indeed starting them young does help, but suggests that diverse sports, as we're talking about right here, instead of early specialisation, to prevent overuse, and also that their socialisation will not be compromised, which is a question I'd written down myself, the impact on kind of that social cohesion and social integration. It makes sense because I've seen 8-year-olds who are junior black belts but lose interest in taekwondo by the time they're in high school or college. So that kind of sustainability, longevity. Thanks for that comment. Andrew's asked a question: challenge to GBs to curb their programs, I'm presuming at international level, Andrew. To what degree does school PE and extracurricular sports time form part of this overall mix?
Yeah, that's like the professionalization. I saw another message in the chat about the professionalization of sport, that people are realizing that parents will pay a lot of money for kids. It's hard to control what a kid is doing. That's what I like about Jodie's research. You know, that simple messaging on how much is too much, because a parent knows what they're doing, right? And these private providers are starting to creep into New Zealand. I was talking to a colleague here. I'm on a course with Sport New Zealand at the moment. He's involved with football, talking about parents paying $8,000 for their kids to go to an academy in Barcelona. And parents under pressure to send them there. It's not Barcelona Football Club. It's a football academy which is in Barcelona, but they're branding it, you know, that my kid's gone to. So a lot of kids, especially in football as well, that's 12 months of the year, right? They've got their regular season. They're playing for the school. They're playing for the club, and if they're representative, they're playing for the representative team. They're signed up for these academies. It's sort of out of control. So even though we've got a government agency that has feeds into the national sports organizations, and national sports organizations talk about the lack of control they've got on the school environment. The school does what they want to do. So I haven't got an answer to that one, Jen. It's a big problem. But I think the opportunity in New Zealand, right? Small country, there's 15 national sports organizations signed up to Balance is Better. I'm down here at a collective here. We've got 12 people here representing different sports. So there's a desire to collaborate, there's a desire to work together, and there's a desire to bring about change. So I think that the desires there, good things can happen, but it's a hard journey.
It's a powerful statement there, Simon, of the kind of collaboration. And I think Andrew's hitting on another question here. I think we've probably answered it, and even around the book and the reach that the book has gotten with the chapters, for a need for coach education, increased risk in organised sport, role of coaches, and in brackets awareness and prevention. All of these, is that just a need for coach education, coach and performance support team if you're in a bigger organization, but also, as we just spoke, with their parents, their role, the vicariously living through their children, being sold a dream. So great point by Andrew there as well. Jodie mentioned 62% of injuries presented were in lower limbs. Any specific data on what issue and joints were mainly affected? That's from iPhone.
That was in the study that I did. And so most of them were knee and ankle. And a lot of them that were the overuse injuries were the classic Osgood-Schlatters and Severs kind of presentations, which are typical in that age group, but also just typical sprains and strains. And again, other research supports that the lower limb is highly injured in a sport environment.
Thanks, Jodie. There's another question from Kieran here in relation to child's diet and picking up injury. Is there any relation? Do we know any research out there?
I think there probably is, but I don't think I can speak to it. It's not something that I have a background to. I've read some stuff on lack of vitamin D. I think that's certainly an issue up in the Northern Hemisphere. We possibly don't have the same issue down here in New Zealand. But yeah, I think like some sports, and I certainly have some of the young athletes that come through my clinic with sort of stress-related injuries, especially in those sports like gymnastics and dancing, who I think there are dietary issues in regards to maybe not getting enough nourishment during those growth years, and that can be contributing to their stress response. Obviously, there's things like the Red S syndromes and stuff. Again, we see this in clinic all the time. So there's a little bit of stuff in dietary. I think that could be a whole separate hour of conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. No, appreciate Kieran's thinking wide and broad on that. So thanks, Jodie, for addressing that. John has asked, did any of these successful athletes have any significant injury incidents?
Not from the studies that we did. It wasn't a focus. It was going through their life history, the quite in-depth interviews. So there's nothing specific jumped out. But I have done another study with athletes who did transition to elite, and one of the women athletes talked about in that she was 18 or 19. There was a national under 20 squad being selected, and she picked up an injury and she disguised it and carried on playing because she wanted to be selected. She got selected for the national squad and then subsequently missed 18 months of the program. The revealing thing was when I asked her, okay, knowing what you do now, would you have made the same decision again? She goes, yes, because if I hadn't been selected, I wouldn't have been in the system and they would have forgotten about me. So we've got a lot of research with athletes underplaying the significance of their injuries and playing on through injury, concussion, but also those injuries where they can carry on playing because then the need to be selected overrides everything else. So we've got some research in that space, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I'm mindful of time, but there's only a couple more questions here. So we have touched on Brian's first comment, which was a major issue in my sport is the private skills development providers. And they're creating an overload for athletes, and mostly during the off season, and they're everywhere. And I'll interject momentarily to say an example. I heard when I first moved to West Ham that at the end of the season we weren't allowed to kind of give our kit away, like staff kit or players, that had to be debranded and used in a certain way, because in one instance someone had taken a jersey from somebody or a t-shirt from somebody, claimed they were from West Ham, and started charging astronomical amounts of money to do one-to-ones. So that just brought that straight to me, Brian. No certification, little to no qualification or training, and the lack of regulation in the sports industry really needed to be addressed at the legislative levels, and a couple of people have kind of thumbs up on that. But following from that, Brian says, I love the data Simon showed on the sport profile of a national athlete. We need more research that shows the proof that you do not need to specialise early to make it. Again, in my sport, ice hockey, people do not seem to care about all the research on increased injury risk. All they believe is that their kid has to be trained all year long as soon as possible in order to make it to the game. How much research is out there that proves this not to be true? I guess in a broad sense on volume, leading researchers on top of what you've shared?
Yeah, I don't think we've got enough, Jen. I think we need more research that actually starts to challenge this notion that you have to specialize. We've got football clubs branding coaching programs over here that kids pay a lot of money to go to, delivered by New Zealand coaches who are already coaching here, but the parents will pay more because it's branded to, I won't name the clubs, but some of them are in the same division, West Hammer, and they have these coaching programs over here accredited to that club. They're just using the name to bring in money, but more research is needed to look at pathways to elite performance. It's an intense study, right? Because you better spend time. It's not a survey. You can't capture that timeline through a survey. We did try and design an online survey to do it. It proved too complex. You need to sit down with somebody and go, what were you doing at the ages of 5? They go away, have conversations with their parents to clarify what they were doing. So the more stories we can tell of these alternative pathways with positive outcomes, the better. You can see just from that timeline that if he hadn't made it as an elite hockey player, he'd still be playing sport, right? He was playing so many sports, still playing golf, and that was true of all the 8 and also the 20 previous Olympic athletes. That, yeah, it's no silver bullet.
No silver bullet. And Tobias has said, kind of some echoing that, Simon, almost is, yes, in a sense that there is need, as you said, Simon, for more research. But Tobias has said, for myself, it's not a matter of the amount of research, but the accessibility. It is about more, it's more about making the existing research available and easy to understand and digestible. So I guess people can gather their thoughts and the word of mouth spreads. There's one question here that I skipped from David, and I think we'll be able to wrap up from there. What is a realistic age for representative competition to be appropriate? I coach girls rugby in the UK.
We've got a problem with maturation, right? So representative rugby, you're picking the players who are the physically most able, the early maturers, and we've seen that in cricket. So cricket isn't as physical as rugby, but the study we did on cricket showed that New Zealand cricket came to us, said, we think we've got a maturation problem. We think that all of our elite players coming through are early maturers, the ones who are maturing early. So we want to know when that's happening. So we went back to a 12 to 13-year-old age group camp where they scrapped the representative tournament and replaced it with a development camp. And we biobanded them and we measured them. There were no late maturers in that camp. So at the ages of 12 or 13, the selection process is, because it's gone to representative, there's already people picking the people who can bowl faster, hit the ball harder. It also has an impact on skill development. We have a problem here in New Zealand. So if you pick the big rugby players, and if it's about winning and it's got a representative tournament, you're going to get the biggest player, the strongest player to run hard and to run straight. 15, 16, when all the other players have caught up from a skill development point of view, that player's lost because all they've done is run hard and run straight. They can't sidestep, they can't offload, they haven't got the other techniques. So it's a lose-lose, a short-term gain. Yeah, you're going to have the strongest players at the ages of 10, 11, and 12 in a representative tournament. So our recommendation is you delay it as long as possible. The challenge is you've got to create opportunities for them to still keep improving. We love competition. You've got to create opportunities for that competitive need to be fulfilled. But reps, if you think about representative tournaments, the earlier that you select, you're deselecting more than you're selecting. You're closing the door on potential. And that young kid, there's a 4-year age range between early developers and late developers. So if you're selecting a 12-year-old, you might be comparing an 8-year-old physiologically to a 16-year-old, where you're going to pick the one who looks like a 16-year-old. And that 8-year-old could be a fantastic football player, cricket player, netball player, basketball player when they catch up. But they might go, hey, I'm no good at this. So I can't compete, and they're lost to the sport. So I would say you delay it as long as possible, but you've got to create really positive opportunities, skill development opportunities, which we're doing here in New Zealand. We're running development camps, multiple coaches there, rotation groups of different skill development, games which we're playing around with biobanding, where we lump them together with similar maturation. But but we've got to be creative. We're still delivering sport the same way we've done. I'm old. We're still doing exactly the same way we did when I was a kid. We've got to be more adaptive, more creative, and actually keep the door open longer for young people. And I think that's the main message. Delay as long as possible. Keep as many people involved in your sport for as long as you can. And then I think good things will happen.